How are y'all doing today? All right, I'm looking mainly at some lights here, so I can see some of you over here and some of you, but nobody right over here. My apologies. And let me just say at the outset that really happy to be here with you. I want to thank Bill Bullard and Eric Nelson for inviting me, and for thanks again to the convention organizers, Jaden Moreland, and everybody else who's putting this together. I'm not an agricultural economist. I'm something of a generalist. I do work in antitrust. And so I'm here with some humility, and I have tried to understand the institutions as I see them, but I also am looking forward to the opportunity to learn from you. And so after the talk, I'm the guy in the suit. If you want to hang out or chat, just come let me know, and I'll try to learn and improve as I go along. What I'm going to talk about today is my understanding of the economics of the industry. As I see it, I'll be describing opinions of mine that I've reached in the process of research that is joint with Francisco, Minji, and Matt. I think what I'm going to say today, it's a little bit of an odd position because based on conversations I've had with some of you, I may be saying things that you have an understanding of already. And this is an unusual situation because normally when I'm talking about these institutions, I have to do a lot of education. But this is a situation where you have experience here, and maybe I'm going to tell you back some things you already know. But that's okay. It's how I see the world. I'm going to start with pointing out that the cattle industry is like a lot of other agricultural industries in that there are many producers, and sitting between the producers and consumers are a set of large intermediaries or agribusinesses, and these businesses play an important role in how payments are allocated across the chain. And so, I see this is going to be interesting. The fonts are going to be, I tried to make really big fonts here because I was standing in the back of the room yesterday and just appreciating. So we may have to deal with some of this if we cut off the boxes. We'll see. Anyway, in the beef industry, we've got thousands of folks who are engaged with the raising of beef and the feeding of beef. That beef ends up being funneled through 4 large packers that account for about 80 to 90% of the transactions there. And then ultimately to retailers, the biggest account among the retailers would be Walmart. All right, so this is a setting already where if you're thinking about the economics and thinking about market power, we're going to be interested in market power pushing upstream as much as market power pushing downstream. In other words, there's the potential for packers to exert market power in a way that would depress prices that would be paid to feedlots and ultimately depress the money that would flow upwards towards the ranchers and stockyards and the cow and calf operations. I'm going to show you a couple plots to start. This is looking at data over 2005 to the end of 2019, and I've cut it off there because some things happened with COVID that are sort of a distinct set of considerations that I don't want to address. The green line is the average price paid for a pound of beef by consumers to retailers. All right, so this is at the top. The red line will be the price, the typical price paid to a packer for the same pound of beef, and then the blue line underneath would be the money that flows to feedlots from the packers. And so we can take away a couple things from this graph already. We can see, for example, that the bulk of the consumer dollar does not reach the feedlots and therefore also not the cow and calf operations. And if we want to understand why, the biggest gap here is actually on the retail side, the amount of money retailers get that don't flow to packers. I'm not going to talk about that. Instead, I want to focus for the purposes of this talk on the packers themselves. And so I'm going to zoom in here. This takes the same 2 lines and just blows them up a little bit. So in red, we've got the average price packers get for a pound of beef, and in blue we have the comparable number for feedlots. And what I'll point out is the gap between these 2 lines. This is what I'll call the packer spread. It widens over 2015 to 2020. So the packer spread is you can think about as the net revenue that the packers obtain that would then go to pay down their costs, and also they could capture some of it in the form of profit. And so this is the phenomenon that I'm interested in exploring. Now, I can look at it this way. This is the gap between the lines. We can see initially, say back in 2005, a typical packer spread was 45 cents perhaps on average. Since 2015, it started increasing. Now it might be about 80 cents. So it's a rough doubling in the packer spread. And this is money that could be flowing upstream that's not. All right, so you're talking to an economist. And so as an economist, if you're going to ask me a question for why is this happening, if you want an economic answer, I can give you two, demand and supply. All right, but I think we can already rule out demand. All right, and the reason is that we haven't really seen many changes here, and if you did think there was changes, you would see other things going on with the retail prices and the prices that packers get that we're just not seeing in the data. So I'm just going to cross this one off. Of course, it's not exactly right. Demand is always going to have some effects, but I don't think it's the main thing going on. So let's think about supply. Let's unpack this, right? Because there's different things that can go on when we talk about supply. So one reason that you might see a rising packer spread is that the packers' costs have gone up. I don't think that's the case. I've seen no evidence of it. Labor costs, as I understand it, have not gone up during the period we're talking about, nor have energy costs, and that's going to account for the bulk of the cost of processing cattle at the packer stage. Another explanation might be mergers among packers that reduce competition. Again, I don't think mergers are the likely explanation. We had a lot of them in this space in the 1980s and the 1970s before that, which doesn't time up with the data I'm showing you. The last major merger we had was, I believe, JBS Smithfield. That's back in 2008. Again, it doesn't line up with what we've seen, and that particular merger didn't have a lot of implications, as I understand it, for local market competition. So mergers, I don't know, I don't think it's a likely explanation. We can go to collusion. Might it be possible that the packers are working together to depress the prices they pay for cattle? That's one I can't rule out. And there's ongoing litigation on this. I know RCAF is exploring this. I know that there's a DOJ investigation about it. However, I'm going to cross it off anyway because I'm actually, my preferred explanation is going to be something else. But I've tried to cross it off sort of with a squiggly line and some question marks because I don't really know. So what is this something else? Okay, and I want to talk about the role of contracts in the industry and the economics of contracts. And I know some of you might be involved with feeding. More of y'all are involved in the cow and calf operations upstream. But this is what I'll be describing as something the feedlots are dealing with. I'm going to start with a graph, and let's see if it works. Here we go. So there's three lines here, and the solid line starts up around 60% of transactions and goes down to about 25% of transactions by the end of the sample. And these are transactions that I'll describe as taking place on something called the cash market. These are negotiated transactions, either for live cattle or potentially something on grid. And you see just this fall that these used to be done in auction barns, not so much now, but the cash market has really shrunk. Going back to 2005, it's nearly 60%. If you went back to, say, 1990, it might have been 80% or 90%. So this is a really remarkable change. The amount of cattle that are transacted under something that I'll call a formula contract has gone from about 40% upwards towards 75%. What is a formula contract? We don't actually have a great idea for it because there's not a good information about what's in these contracts. Sometimes they're informal, sometimes there's formal. I don't have good visibility into them. But they have a flavor of an agreement between a feedlot and a packer. And when the feedlot gets a cattle, they can agree to sell it to a packer at some future date when the cattle are ready. Okay, so that is locked in. What's not locked in is the price. All right, and the price setting mechanism in the formula contract is that the price that will be paid to the feedlot will be determined by the price that's realized on the cash market at the date of the transaction. It might be 3 months or 4 months or 5 months in the future. Okay, this is what a formula contract is. There's another set of contracts called a forward contract down there. It's a smaller percentage of sales, maybe 10 to 15%, maybe a little less than that. These are contracts that are pegged to the futures price on the CME, and they have some of the same economic effects of the formula contract, and I'll get into those, but it's a little bit more nuanced. So I won't go into the details on the forward contracts just for the sake of simplicity. So this is a real change in the market that's happened, comparing, say, 2005 to 2019. And I want to sort of explain why it's meaningful, why economics tells us it's meaningful. To do so, I want to take you to pricing class. So this is sort of the framework I think about pricing, the way I would teach pricing to one of my business students at Georgetown. And the way I teach pricing is that there's, firms can set higher prices and then set lower prices. And there's a trade-off involved. If you set a higher price, the good thing is you get more margin every time you make a sale. If you set a low price, the good thing is that you get more volume. All right, so how do you balance that, right? Should you go higher? Should you go lower? Well, if you set a price that's too high, you're going to have a really good margin but make no sales, so that's no good. If you set a price that's too low, you're going to sell a bunch of stuff but there's no profit there, right? So that's not going to work either. So what I tell my business students is the right price is somewhere in the middle, and you've got to balance the consideration of getting enough volume with enough margin. And that's the way I think about pricing. So let's take this to packers in the cash market. Okay, and we can think about packers as they're bidding for cattle from feedlots in the cash market, all right? And normally this would be just sort of a straight analog. They can submit a lower bid, and if they do that, they're going to get more margin in the cash market, right? Or they could submit higher bids, and they'll pick up more volume, all right, in the cash market. And they'll balance that sort of thing. And this is the normal way you'd think about it. But I want to add in the consideration of contracts, okay? I didn't mean to have all these animations here. I'll just click through them. If you submit a low bid in the cash market and you've got contract cattle coming in with formula contracts, then when you submit that lower bid, then you pay less for the formula contracts to which you've already committed to buy, all right? Because those formula contracts are pegged to the cash market price. Whereas if you submit a higher bid, now you're going to pay more for the formula contracts. Again, these are transactions already locked in. And so this incentive, this just fact about the way formula contracts are written is going to create an economic incentive for packers to submit lower bids in the cash market so that they pay less money on the formula contract cattle that they've already committed to buy. And this is an unambiguous incentive. All right. Now, what I've said is that that's going to result in lower prices that are paid for cattle in the cash market. But it's also true that it means that lower prices will be realized on all cattle that are purchased. All right. The reason is that if prices go down in the cash market, prices also go down on the cattle that are transacted on formula contracts, which are pegged to the cash market price. And prices are also going to go down on cattle that are contracted with forward contracts, because those are pegged to the CME futures price, which of course is going to converge to the cash market price as the date of the contract comes up. Okay, so this affects all prices in the market. The magnitude here is going to depend on two things. All right, the magnitude of the effect will depend on how many formula contracts there are. If there are a lot of formula contracts, you can save a whole lot more money by lowering your price in the cash market. So this is the first consideration, and this is why it's relevant that we've seen that the number of formula contracts has gone up considerably over the last 20 years or so. The second thing that matters here is the ability of packers to influence the cash market price. All right. If packers can't influence the cash market price, then there's no pricing distortion that's introduced by formula contracts. Okay. And so if packers are small, and any one of them is because they're so small, when they bid aggressively or less aggressively, they don't really change what happens very much. There's no effect. Okay. But that's not the world we live in. We live in a world in which the packers are large. And together, the four main packers account for 80 or 90% of the sales. If any one of them bids more or less aggressively in the cash market price, then the cash market will move. Okay, so these two things together are what's going to determine the magnitude. A bit more on magnitudes, given the current market configurations, and I do this in the paper, okay, and I've got to make some strong assumptions here. But if you make some strong assumptions and just try to back out a rough estimate of how much this might matter, what I've been able to come up with so far is that the presence of formula contracts may roughly double Packers' profit margins, where by profit margin I mean the Packer spread minus the variable cost of processing cattle. So that's a big effect. But on the other hand, we already knew the effect might be big because we've got a Packer spread that's doubling roughly within the last 20 years. All right, so this is economic theory. I've been working with economic theory, trying to ground it in the facts of the industry. And it's reasonable to ask whether there's information that can be provided by the data that will be consistent with the theory. And the answer is yes. So in my work, I'm able to provide a statistical analysis of cash market prices over 2005 to 2019, in which we analyze the prices that are realized on the cash market on a week-to-week basis. And what we're able to show is that when there's more formula contracts coming in, cash market prices are lower. Okay? If say, formula contracts account for a 1 percentage point more among all the contracts, then prices are 6% lower, all else equal. This seems like a meaningful effect. It's consistent with the theory. It doesn't prove we're right because we're not able to rule out some alternative explanations, but that's not entirely the point. The point is that at least what we see in the data is consistent with the theory, and it gives me some confidence that the theory may be right. So let me talk a little bit about the strategy of packing. And I think that packers have a tough industry, and I'll break this down for you. Packers, when they get through with the beef, what they've got left over is boxed beef. And despite attempts to turn boxed beef into a differentiated product, most people think that for the large part it's a commodity. And they're selling a commodity. It's easy to ship on refrigerated trucks or on refrigerated rail cars. And they're selling that commodity to sophisticated buyers like Walmart and other retailers. Therefore, it is difficult for packers, or one might think it's difficult for packers to find ways to raise prices that they can obtain from retailers. It's just a difficult nut to crack. Now, on the other hand, if there's a way to exercise market power for beef packers to grow their margins, looking upstream seems a little bit more promising. Right? That's where the power asymmetry is a lot greater. And furthermore, if you look upstream, you're not dealing with the commodity anymore. All right? And the reason is that transportation costs really matter. For one, if you've got a feedlot in one spot, even though there are a number of independent packers out there, and there's 4 big packers to choose from, not all of those operations are going to be relevant for the feedlot because it costs money to ship your cattle, both in terms of the money you spend and in terms of the shrinkage you get. All right, and so the local markets are going to be less competitive than you would even think if you considered sort of the national market shares of the packers. And so it's more promising to think upstream. So now the interesting thing here is if beef packers are able to lower the price to feedlots, then short run that's really nice. Their margin expands. And this is the effect I've been talking about, but it's worth also thinking about the long run. Look, if the feedlots aren't earning as much money, they can't stay in business as well, right? And that flows up. It matters for all of y'all too. As you get pinched, it's harder to stay in business. And what economic theory tells us is if you got an industry that's earning less money, then it's going to shrink. And that's just the way of it. And over the years, it might be that some folks retire, fewer folks go in. It might be that some folks go bankrupt and exit. It can happen different ways. But in the end, if there's a lower price that's paid to feedlots, we're going to expect that upstream there will be fewer cattle produced, and the beef that comes out of that will become more scarce. The interesting thing is that actually works out just fine for the beef packers. because the one way to negotiate higher prices when you have an undifferentiated commodity that you're selling to retailers is by providing scarcity in the market. And so this is one instance where lower prices paid to feedlots can end up with higher prices that packers are able to obtain from retailers in the long run. It also means the interests of cow and calf operators and the interests of feedlots are aligned with the interests of consumers. If we can provide a robust amount of money that flows upstream, we'll have more cattle, that we can have more folks stay in business. More cattle means more beef. That means lower prices and a greater supply to consumers. Okay, I'm gonna pause here. I'm gonna just do a little bit of rebuttal because I know that there's a fair amount of economists out there that have told folks that market power among the packers is not a problem. The USDA, to its credit, has commissioned studies by academics to try to understand market power in this sector. The quality of those studies, I think, is maybe not entirely what we would want. I just put two that have been influential. Some of you may have seen some of them. One is a 2007 study commissioned by GIPSA that looked at formula contracts. The other is the result of a conference proceedings held June 2021 at Texas A&M University. And there are some claims that come out of these analyses. The first is that supply and demand economics indicate that contracts are innocuous. That is not true. It depends on a strong assumption that all players in this market are small and cannot move market prices, which factually appears to be incorrect, as packers are actually quite large relative to the market. Another claim is that the market is just too complicated to fix and too complicated to understand. But I don't think that's right either. I've just tried to explain it to you, and I think it's actually relatively straightforward. And then a third claim is that the empirical evidence shows that there's no problem, and I won't get into the details of what's been done, but this does not hold water either. So I think one of my goals here is to provide an economic analysis that lays things out in a way that reflects modern economic thinking and can guide policymakers going forward. Okay, back to the economics. There's some questions I want to tackle here. The first is why would a feedlot sign a formula contract in the first place if I've told you it has some negative repercussions, including on their own ability to stay in business? But I want to point a couple things out. The first is that a formula contract does some good things for a feedlot. The first is that it lowers the risk that the feedlot has. It provides the feedlot with an assurance of a buyer. These days, when the cash market is thin, there's a real risk to the feedlot that when they go onto the cash market, there's no buyer for their cattle at the time that would be efficient to sell the cattle. And so they end up selling the cattle too young to avoid the risk, or they feed the cattle longer and spend more money before they're able to sell it, or they have to, they can't hold it on feed, long enough, or feeding is not really efficient anymore. So there's a variety of risks associated with the cash market right now, just because it can be hard to find a buyer. So the formula contracts mitigate that risk. I'll also point out that the feedlot that signs a formula contract gets the same price whether they sign the contract or they don't, right? Because if they sign the contract, they're going to get the price on the cash market. If they don't sign the contract, they're still going to get the price on the cash market, whatever that is, okay? And so there's no real, you might as well do it actually if you have lower risk and you're getting the same price. And this is something in economics we call a collective action problem. All right, what's going on is that feedlots are small relative to the market. Okay, so when one feedlot signs a formula contract, it doesn't really change the cash market price. They might as well do it. Okay, but when a lot of feedlots sign formula contracts, there's enough there that it changes the bidding incentives of the packers and has an impactful decision on the cash market price. So what my interpretation here is that it makes good sense for a feedlot to sign a formula contract, even if collectively, when you look at the problem, the feedlots would be better off without the formula contracts. This is what we call a collective action problem. All right, so the second question is it the case that the formula contracts are really all bad? And the answer is going to be no. Okay, for the feedlots, I've already mentioned that it lowers risk. You get the same price, but it also can be good for packers in a way that's actually beneficial to society. Packers are going to be able to have a more predictable source of supply. That will allow them to utilize their plants more efficiently and lower their costs. And some of those cost reductions will be passed through to other parties, including feedlots and consumers downstream. This is what they claim the benefit of contracts being, and I think we can take this seriously. I think it's a real thing. But it also points to what I view as sort of the central irony here. Okay? The main benefits of formula contracts, as I understand it, exist because the cash market is thin. Right? Because the cash market is thin, the feedlots need to lower their risk because it can be difficult to find a buyer. Because the cash markets are thin, the packers need to find a source of predictable supply. But the cash market is thin because of the presence of formula contracts. Okay? So let's just think about this, right? If the cash market were thick, packers could be able to obtain more reliable supply. All right? Feedlots would be able to find a buyer. Therefore, many benefits of the contracts would dissipate. Okay? And the terms of trade, as I understand economic theory, would tilt towards the feedlots. Okay? Pointing towards solutions, this in some sense goes above my pay grade. It's, you heard from Angie Green, who's doing a fantastic job at USTA, but my analysis does point towards some things. I'll just lay them out. And I won't really talk about feasibility. I'm just going to talk about sort of from the economics, what we may or may not be interested in or what may or may not be effective. The first solution is a regulatory solution here. And I'm pointing this out the problem with the formula contracts is that, as I already mentioned, it sort of makes sense for everybody to use them. Right? Individually, these decisions make sense. So how do you deal with a market that the individual incentives are not aligned with collective incentives? And the answer is often going to be to create sort of new rules that align incentives a little bit better. Okay, so one solution is a regulatory solution that would ban or substantially curtail the use of formula contracts. It would, be possible to retain the benefit of contracts because there would be a thicker cash market. That's the basic idea, and I know that that's a lot of what's being discussed with Senator Grassley's bill, and the USDA has been working with Congress on a solution like this. The second idea is to allow formula contracts to be used, but not to be pegged to the cash market price. Right? The problem here is that the contracts that are signed are the prices that are paid are then pegged to the cash market price. And that's what creates the distortion on the packers' bidding incentives. If you can break that link, then you can have contracts in place that are able to provide assurance of supply for feedlots and provide a stable source of supply and allow for higher utilization for packers. Those contracts can have those effects without the distortionary incentives on the packers' bidding incentives. The third solution I hear some folks ask about is an antitrust solution, and it would involve actually breaking up the packers. Now, why would that work? Well, it might work to some extent, right? Because if the packers are smaller relative to the market, then no one packer will have the same ability to move the cash market price. And if the packers have a smaller ability to move the cash market price, then the distortions introduced by formula contracts would be smaller. The economics suggests this as a solution. As a practical matter, I think this is likely going to be infeasible just based on the history of the United States. The number of times we've broken up companies is quite small. So, some of us might remember the breaking up Ma Bell, back in the 60s or the 70s. It happens, but that was a monopolist, and we don't have monopolies here. We've got four packers, and so I just as if we want to think about sort of what's politically feasible, I would go for the regulatory solutions. Okay, this has been an update on ongoing research. I've tried to describe the economics of the market as I see it, given the data and given how I understand the market institutions. I appreciate you for entertaining thoughts on something that remains what I would describe research in progress. I'm trying to learn more as I go along. Academic work sometimes proceeds at a glacial pace, but I'll keep at it. I'll try to produce more results and build more confidence. And my hope is that in the end, we're able to contribute to a better understanding of capital markets and then ultimately perhaps have some influence on other economists and also on the policymakers at the USDA and in Congress. So thank you for your time.
Okay, we have time for a few questions for Nathan. Brett's going to be on that side, and I'll be on this side. So,
thank you for your speech. That's excellent. Could you expound just a little more on one of your last statements there on why we don't have a monopoly currently in this? What do you consider it to be?
Economists don't have, we don't always have useful definitions of monopoly. And so it's as an economist, it's almost a difficult question to answer. But if you look at the market shares of the Packers at a national level, on average, those big four are going to have market shares on the order of 20% each, right? And it is perfectly possible that there's a set of economic institutions in place that allow the Packers to maintain prices that would be at the monopoly level without the presence of monopoly itself. And among those institutions is actually the presence of contracts. But the market shares, I think, are actually, from a legal antitrust perspective, the biggest hurdle. I think it would be difficult to get a court to agree that there's a monopoly here when actually you have four actors, each of which has an appreciable market share.
I found your comments very useful. Thank you for being here. Have you done any research at all on the effect of collusion? In other words, fight collusion with collusion. In other words, get enough producers together in a national organization so that instead of dealing with a couple of hundred calves or cattle at a time, you're dealing in tens of thousands a head at any one given time, and dealing with a packer, for an example.
Yeah. A couple comments. One is that I'm not sure that the Packers are colluding, I can't rule that out. But one of the things that I try to convey in the talk is that their own incentives might, because of the contracts, might produce outcomes that are similar to outcomes you would attain if they are colluding. But the difference is that with the contracts, it's legal, whereas with collusion, it's illegal. Okay, and this may be one of the reasons that you see problems in the market, but the DOJ ultimately can't take action, is that the way the antitrust laws are written, in the absence of communications between the Packers talking about price, it can be difficult to bring antitrust enforcement action. But instead, what we've got is a set of institutions that allow for the same outcomes in the market that may not require communication between the parties, and that's just, I think, one thing to know. Now, but the main thrust of your question is whether it might be possible to negotiate collectively with the Packers, and my answer to that is that in principle it would be possible. But in practice, it would be very difficult. And I think the reason I would say it's difficult is that when it comes down to it, there are hundreds or thousands of feedlots, and lining everybody up would be challenging. And in that sort of situation, you have a free rider problem in which any one feedlot acting in its own interest has an incentive to maybe deviate from what's good for the collective. And so, sometimes these problems are resolved. In this country, we have, for example, a history of labor unions, used to sort of address the same sort of challenge. And so I don't want to rule it out, and I think RCAF is a fantastic organization and sort of brings a lot of you together, right? And so if something could be built on that, then I can't rule it out again. But I think it would be challenging, and I think that's why sort of thinking about how government could help, or how the USDA could help in a way that wouldn't be intrusive but might help support the outcomes that would be more favorable, is a productive way to go.
Thank you for coming to our convention. Enjoyed your presentation, but there's one thing I think you left out, and that's the effect of imports. If you look at the figures there, it went from 10% imports to approximately 20%. I think you left that out. Another issue is when you talked about a buyer for these fat cattle. And back when we used to feed cattle and sell to the packers, we were lucky if we had a buyer to bid on them. In a competitive market, you would think you would have buyers. We don't have that. Could you address that?
Yeah, 2 points. One is my understanding of the import market is actually thinner than I would like, but I'd love to talk to you more about that. I do see it in the data, and I'd be interested in how you view that affecting your business. And on the second point about the number of bidders that you've got available to you right now, I completely agree. My understanding is that at the moment, often you obtain a single bidder. And that's just consistent with my view of how these formula contracts shape the bidding incentives. You could have a situation where another packer would come in and provide a second bid, give a better price. But the packer, as it does that, is going to move the cash market price. And the incentive to do so is dampened in the presence of formula contracts. It used to be you'd go to an auction barn, and you might have to go back 20, 30 years. My co-author, Matt Weinberg's uncles used to work in an auction barn. And there you'd have something, I think, closer to what you would think of as being a competitive market. And so what I'm trying to talk about and to explain is sort of like, why is it the case that prices don't seem to you to reflect competition? And can we understand what the change has been? And one explanation that makes a lot of sense to me as an economist is that packers, because of the contracts, have incentives not to compete against each other, which is why the prices you're seeing are not what you would call a competitive price.
Thank you for your information. We appreciate that and your attendance. The packer collusion, I think if we have government regulation, we just create a bureaucracy that will be very difficult to manage. I think the breakup of the packers would be a better solution.
In antitrust, going outside of this industry for a moment, sometimes we're faced with a situation in which we can try to challenge a merger which preserves competition, or accept some sort of agreement with the company after it merges, in which it promises not to do various nefarious anti-competitive things. And in that setting, my view, and I think that of many in antitrust, is that it's better to just prevent an anti-competitive merger in the first place than trying to negotiate an agreement about behavior afterwards. Because when you negotiate an agreement afterwards, you've got to follow up, you've got to monitor it, people have to be engaged with that, it takes resources. Whereas if you were to block the merger entirely, then you don't have to think about it. You just let the market work. And flipping that around, I'm sympathetic to the notion that we might prefer a solution that involves simply letting the market work, but having a market in which the packers have less market power and are smaller relative to the market. The question is, how do we get there? And understanding, what the antitrust laws say and how those antitrust laws are interpreted by the courts. I don't know that there is a feasible path towards an antitrust solution along the lines you propose. And but I should say again, that's I'm an economist, not an attorney, and that sort of that determination eventually is or at the end is above my pay grade to some extent. But that's how I see it.
Hi, Nathan, back here. Mary Hendrickson at the University of Missouri. I really like this, and I'm very excited about it. But a couple of questions I have. Does the analysis change if you think about, like right now, it looks like feedlots are just like the same, right? But there are feedlot operators in here that, might have 1,000 head, and there's feedlot operators in the U.S. that have throughput of 500,000. So, does that make a difference in terms of that? In terms of your analysis. The second question, does it matter who owns like upstream too, if there are some ownership issues like that where ownership could be connected to the packers between the feedlot and the packers? Does that change anything in the analysis?
Let me try to tackle those in turn. One of the fantastic things about this industry is that if you're engaged as a feedlot or as a cow-calf operation, you can sort of choose how you want to do it. And there's a lot of different companies out there. With respect to feedlots, you've got some that are more or less industrial, and they exist at different sizes, and that's fine. That sort of heterogeneity, I don't believe affects my analysis. And the reason is that even if you look at a big feedlot, that feedlot, as I understand it, is going to be small relative to the regions that for which the USDA reports prices through the mandatory price reporting data. So you take even a big feedlot in Kansas, for example. That big feedlot in Kansas is not going to be large relative to the number of cattle that are transacted in Kansas. But that's not true if you compared, for example, the number of cattle transacted in Kansas to the size of National Beef, for example. They've got two giant plants there. And so I think that in terms of order of magnitudes, there's a difference between the size of the packers and the size of even the larger feedlots. Now, if you think factually that's not right, please let me know, and I'll think harder about it. Second question, Mary, what was the second question? Ownership upstream. So this is the packer-owned cattle. This is something that I really want to know more about, and I found it really hard to get up to speed. And so I'd like to hear more from you about that. But the couple reasons is that I found it hard to get up to speed is that folks use packer-owned cattle to mean different things sometimes, and the data that are available to us on packer-owned cattle are they define packer-owned cattle as data that are owned by the packer for more than 2 weeks. And it strikes me that sometimes when we think about this, we might be thinking about much longer than 2 weeks in terms of the ownership structure. So the data are not tremendously helpful in getting a handle on what's going on. So all that's to say is that when it comes to packer-owned cattle, as an economist, as an outsider looking at this, I don't have an ability to say as much as I would like. I do think that having packer-owned cattle does allow and give the ability of the packers to stay away from the cash market price to a greater degree, as they see fit. I think that's straightforward. So it's something that we need to be thinking about here.
I really appreciate your presentation. I'm over here to the other direction here, but anyhow, I was involved in a small packing plant, and we provided to a small chain store all their beef in California, and the one thing that I kind of questioned in your presentation was the retail prices and so forth, because in that retail chain, he continually told us that he used beef as a drawing card to get people to his grocery stores, so he made the profits on other things. I wonder if your retail prices are actually reflective of what they actually sell the meat for.
That's a good question. Let's see. What I can say is that so the data I have got on retail prices is coming from the Economic Research Service of the USDA. It's intended to capture something about the value that the retailers obtain when they sell their beef, over all retailers in the United States. I believe it's over the U.S., so it's some big aggregate number. Certainly, it's going to mean different things to different retailers. I think, for the purposes that I'm using it, it's probably reasonable for those purposes, which is to say, it's a lot bigger than the price that's obtained by packers for the beef.
Good morning. Thank you very much for being here. But I just kind of want to put a pin in a thought here. You say that there's no monopoly, but I think we need to take this picture a little bit bigger and understand that Tyson and Cargill, all of these packers are not just making money off of our beef. They vertically integrated the chicken market and the pork market, and they control those protein base as well as having the impossible beef market. So I think it's important to understand that even though there's this belief that there's no monopoly within the beef industry, I think that we need to understand that in the protein industry, there very much is a control amongst those individuals or companies, actually.
Yeah, and if you think about control, as an economist, what I hear you saying is that they have market power, and I agree. And I think the prices that come out of the system are not what you would necessarily call a competitive price. Monopoly is really not so much an economic term as a legal term, and so what I caution against is sort of over optimism about the ability to challenge the packers legally for having monopolies when there are 4 packers in this country that are all large, and I mean that's a fact, and it's the way it is. I think that the productive way to go about finding solutions is more likely to involve thinking about ways we can tilt their incentives or provide a more fair market so that we can get better outcomes. In light of the size of the 4 of them.
Thank you very much for your information. The information that you've given is very thorough and very, very helpful. I've got one that's kind of falls underneath that collusion factor, I'm afraid, and I'll try my best to explain it here. There are knowns and unknowns, as you have said. I don't know how you can figure it in, actually, but what about the deals made? I'm just going to leave it with deals made. I've got a friend that 20 years ago used to work for one of the big 100,000 head plus lots, and they were going broke, and they actually went to one of the packers and asked them if there was some way they could be assisted. And needless to say, they are now one of the biggest feedlots. Mm-hmm. The assistance was given, and I truly believe, I know more, and I'm not going to say anything because I don't want anybody getting shot. The fact of the matter is the deal that was made was a profit, expenses plus profit. And people don't understand that. How can these big feedlots keep going? They keep saying. The fact of the matter is they can because there's a profit. That's why. Is there any way, have you heard that before? Is there any factors figure into any of this here? It sure doesn't look like, because the margin, the other question that I have is the margin between the retailer making that much money and the packer making only a lot smaller amount. boy, that doesn't, I mean, I looked at the counter, I look at what we get, and I look at what they're getting, and it sure looks a lot different than what appears. Thank you.
Thank you. That particular story I hadn't heard before, but maybe that's a good thing. Look, I think one thing that we can take away is that getting more information about what's going on can only be a good thing in terms of the ability to describe accurately how the markets work, in terms of making informed policy choices. And my understanding is that Andy Green and others at USDA are trying to push an effort to learn more about these contracts and to learn more about other aspects of the market. And so my hope is that part of that is information that helps us know more about the institutions and the outcomes that arise in the markets, and ultimately towards the mechanisms that may be productive or useful to be thinking about using.
I just had one question there. How familiar are you with Capper-Volstead?
I believe at one point I was familiar with it, but maybe it's been a while. Maybe you can refresh my memory afterwards.
I can't answer that. I'm too busy running the mic around.
Basically, is that on? Capper-Volstead Act was passed back in 1922, and it was passed mainly because buyers of farm commodities were getting fewer and fewer, and the producers were still many. And the Capper-Volstead Act was passed to give them the legal right to get together for bargaining, processing, and all those things. And so it's a wonderful tool that's still available to the producers today if we will use it. And
Yeah,
of course that takes, in order to make Capper-Volstead work, you have to get numbers of producers together in order to have an effective bargaining with the packers or other buyers there. So anyway, it's been a useful tool, and I'm part of another organization, National Farmers, that is very active in this field. So have you done much research into that?
Having you describe it, I remember where I've read about it, and the answers that when I teach my business students at Georgetown, at least a few years ago, I used an example of the potato growers. And there's something called the U.S. Potato Growers Association, and one of the things that they've tried to do over the years is line up producers to plant fewer potatoes, which will drive up the price, and they've had mixed success. I think and of course that's legal, as I understand it, under the act that you're describing. The interesting thing here is that I think that the health of the upstream producers here, the cow and calf operations, unlike the situation with potatoes, doesn't depend on restricting supply. Really, I think that upstream producers can do well, even supplying more. And so I think the way you might approach this economically would be different than associations would in other agricultural environments. And of course, the reason that I'm saying this is I don't view the obstacle as sort of one of oversupply in the market. I view the obstacle more about the bidding incentives of the packers. And so if you can find a way to create an incentives for packers to bid more aggressively in the market, I think that'll push more money upstream and ultimately encourage more folks to stick it out longer, or for more folks to enter the business and produce more cattle. So it's but take that as something of a response.
Right. Just as a point of interest, the potato growers with their organization, the grocers and potato buyers, mostly on the East Coast, filed a lawsuit against their organization, and they won. because what they tried to do was to get the potato growers to hold back potatoes in order to drive the market price up, and they found that that was illegal to do that. It is not illegal to hold plantings to a certain level and so on, but they were holding back and not allowing some of these potatoes to go to market, and that's where they ran into trouble, and the lawsuit was won by the buyers in that, because there was a definition of Capper-Volstead that you cannot restrict the supply in order to drive the market up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, back here to the back on the other side. My question is, have you looked at the effects of the CME futures market and how they use that to manipulate the cash market? If you haven't, I think that's something that needs to be looked into.
Maybe we can talk afterwards. I've not looked into it. I'd be interested in learning more about, if you have thoughts about what in particular I should be looking at. It is an interesting thing. And of course, some of the contracts are going to be tied to CME specifically.